Okay guys, so we're looking at equivalent fractions, but also we're looking at simplifying fractions. So both of these are really fundamental skills when we look at fractions. And the first thing I want to do is I want to go through some key elements of a fraction and understanding the different parts. So firstly, if we look at this one here, the top number is called the numerator, and we're going to write these down. So the numerator is on top of your fraction. Okay, and then we have a line in the middle, okay, and that line there is called the vinculum, okay, vinculum. Now, we're going to talk about the vinculum more because that's really important, but firstly, the bottom number, which a lot of you probably know, is the denominator. Now, our vinculum means divide, okay? So if you see the symbol vinculum, it means divide. And if I was to break that down and say, okay, well, let's look at 1 over 2. 1 over 2, if we actually do the division, 1 divided by 2, and I encourage you to do this with your calculator. Grab your calculator and go 1 divided by 2, you will get the answer 0.5. Okay, so if we actually do the division of fractions, it will give us the decimal answer. Okay, so if you did 36 divided by 40, it would give you a decimal answer. And we'll talk about what that answer is a little bit later. It's going to be 0.9. But it will give you the decimal answer. Okay, so it's a good way of turning fractions into decimals as well if you need to. Important to understand that this is also 50%. Okay, so percentages, decimals, and fractions are related really closely together. So when we look at fractions, firstly, what we need to know is we need to know this thing called equivalence. So we can have equivalent fractions. So let's just say if I've got 1/2, okay, at the moment that is 1/2, okay, that equals 1 over 2. So we have one part, which is the numerator, okay, in a section that allows for two parts. Okay, so at the moment it looks like a pie or a pizza, and we have half of that. Okay, so the numerator is what we have, and the denominator is how big the container is, or how many parts of the container it takes to fill up the whole thing. So if we had both parts, we would have one whole, okay, which in this instance would be 2 over 2. Okay, we'd have one whole. Now, we can represent 1/2 as a different fraction. We could also represent 1/2 as 2 over 4. We'd have the same size pizza. However, this time, rather than being cut in half, it would be cut into quarters, all right? We'd still have 2 quarters, okay? And it's still exactly the same amount of pizza, except it's just been cut up into different sizes, okay? Now, equivalent fractions, when we're finding equivalent fractions, and we're going to find some equivalent fractions for 1/5, the first thing that you would do is you would times 1/5 by 2, the top and the bottom, and that would give us 2/10. Now that is an equivalent fraction. Now, if you were going to find the next equivalent fraction for 1/5, what would it be? All right, now I think a lot of you probably looked at 2/10 and you thought, I'm going to double that again. So I got the answer 4 over 20. Now that's correct and incorrect at the same time, because 4 over 20 is indeed equivalent to 1/5. However, it is not its next equivalent fraction. Its next equivalent fraction is if we times 1/5 by 3. So we'd end up with 3 over 15. Okay, its next equivalent one would be if we times our original fraction by 4. So we would end up with 4 over 20. So that's where, rather than doubling each one every single time, when we end up with these really big fractions, it's easier to multiply, when finding equivalent fractions, multiply your original one by 2, by 3, by 4. Okay, so that's how we find equivalent fractions. Now, this is really important because you're going to have to simplify a lot when you're doing fractions. So when we simplify a fraction, basically what we want to do is we want to find a number that we can divide the top number by and the bottom number by. Now, a lot of you will look at this, and I'm sure, and if I said to you, think of a number that you can divide 36 and 40 by, your first response would probably be 2, and that works fine. If I was to divide 36 by 2, I'd get 18, and if I divided 40 by 2, I'd get 20. Okay, that's fine. But it's important to remember to look at that fraction again and say, is there another number that I can divide 18 and 20 by? And of course there is. We can divide it by 2 again, and we get to our answer of 9/10. Coming back to what we talked about in the beginning, that equals 0.9. However, we can get there more quickly, because the highest common factor of these two numbers is 4. Okay, so if we divide both of these by 4, okay, we end up with 9/10 straight away. So whenever you divide and simplify fractions, it's really important to try to find a big factor, or the biggest factor that you can think of. And the reason for that is if we end up with an enormous fraction, like 235 over 400, okay, it's far easier to get down to your simplest form quickly by dividing it by a large factor, certainly a factor that's bigger than 2, even though we can't divide that by 2, okay? So that's equivalence and simplifying fractions. Don't forget these things. These are really important as we move into fractions. And good luck with that topic.